Well, good morning. Thank you all for being here today. We are going to start a very long course, but we're not going to do it all in one day, so we'll just do a little bit of it to begin with. We're going to, I had that inspiration to do a connected course on the Buddhist tradition. That is to start from the beginning of when Buddhism arose and talk about it up until the present time. And I have been teaching topics on Buddhism for about 40 years now. And one teaches a little bit here, and a little bit there, and a little bit over here, and down there, and up here, and so forth. And I thought it'd be interesting, and since I'm not getting younger, to put it together into sort of a complete narrative. I think it's important, whatever tradition it is that you're following, to have a good understanding of it. I find that I'm sympathetic and somewhat of a participant in Christian practices, but I'm always dismayed at how little of the history of Christianity people understand. And here in Buddhism, I think it's really important, particularly being a new tradition in the West, that we understand it very completely. So we'll talk a lot about early Buddhism. We'll talk about later developments. We'll get to China and Japan and Tibet, and pretty much cover the whole thing, Buddha's willing, and get a full sense of understanding. Now, of course, complementing understanding is the meditation practice. Meditation practice is key, because ultimately our understanding that we're developing here is not one of mastering concepts or stories or ideas, but it's an intuitive reality, intuitive recognition of reality, pure reality as it is, unencumbered by concepts of any kind. But before we get to that, we'll talk a little bit about the stories and ideas of the early tradition. So this morning, I wanted, we'll be talking today about the Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, the Buddha of our era, and talk about the life of the Buddha and how that is relevant to us today. Interestingly enough, the life of the Buddha, there is sort of a gospel of the Buddha. It was written, this is called the Buddha Karita, or Acts of the Buddha. It was written by a writer called Ashvaghosha, who lived in the 1st century. And that's interesting, because the 1st century was also when you got the life of Jesus, as in the 4 Gospels. So there was a period in time where the idea of having a life of your founder was considered to be a useful thing. But in the Buddha's case, this life of the Buddha is being written 400 years after he lived. Of course, in the case, if you study the Christian tradition, they're also writing some years afterwards, but not quite that many. So what you have when you have a life of a figure like this, or a legendary religious figure, that historically speaking, in critical Western academic way of looking at things, you really don't know what these people were like, what their lives were like. By the time the lives get written, they've become a legend. They have an ideal character. So, I mean, for all we know, the Buddha might have weighed 400 pounds and not moved around very much. We have no idea. But that, of course, you don't portray that, and when you do the mythological account, the Buddha is a perfect human being with 32 marks of a perfect human being, or 108 marks of the perfect human being. And similarly, if you're going to become a religious legend, they'll clean up your life a bit when they do the accounting of it, because that makes for a better story. Now, in the case of the life of the Buddha, although it was written, the best version, which I suggest you'll find a copy, it's on Amazon. There is one that was written in Sanskrit, which is by Ashvaghosha, and there's another one where someone in China later wrote a life of the Buddha too, based on Ashvaghosha. And those are both available they're not expensive. But Ashvaghosha, when he was writing, he also had the benefit by the 1st century of a lot of sutras that, although the historical Buddha, they actually do not know when he lived. They dispute it. My sense from reading the different scholarly accounts is that he lived around 460 to 380 BC. But earlier tradition puts him about 100 years earlier. Some people have put him even closer in time. The interesting thing about if he's living around 400 and he's active around 400 BC is that puts him squarely at the time of Socrates. And so you get this interesting thing. It's called the age of the sage in comparative religion. That all of a sudden you had Confucius in China, you had Socrates in Greece, you had the Buddha. And what characterizes all of these sages is that earlier accounts of reality were heavily mythological and involved lots of deities and cults and ritual practices and such. But here, at this great turning, you get sages who speak clearly, rationally, and attempt to make a reasonable argument for why you should live a certain way, why you should be virtuous, why you should do this rather than that, and so forth. So the characteristic mark of the Buddha and Socrates and Confucius is that they spoke to the intelligence within human beings. They said, look, we're all intelligent, let's sit down and talk about what reality is from the point of view of logic and intelligence and kind of an intellectual recognition of reality without appeal to divine authority of any kind. So that characterizes the Buddha. And so the Buddha, at some point, now known as Shakyamuni Buddha, lived and taught, and tradition developed around that. And in the early years of the tradition, everything is an oral teaching. Everyone remembers what the Buddha taught. Contrary to later mythological elaboration, they don't remember word for word everything he taught, and that they can recite. The collected Pali Sutras, which are the teachings that say Shakyamuni said this, they're philosophed like that. And although the Indians are known for their great memory, that would be really pushing it to have them remember that much. And if you look at the actual text, you realize, like the gospel texts, like any text of this sort, they were written by a lot of different people. Anonymous people like ourselves actually, who got inspired and wrote something and stuck to the genre. So there's a certain genre that's the Pali Sutras are, and it's a type of literary creation. First, it's an oral creation; it's just a story creation or a Dharma discourse tradition. But later, it becomes written down, and it's being written down about the time Ashvaghosha starts to write his life. So he's got access now to written accounts. And some of the sutras, the early sutras, the Buddha talks about parts of his life, so he can draw on that. So Ashvaghosha is trying to stay true to all the sutras that he has access to at his point in time, and to write that story. And the sutras themselves are fascinating because it's the earliest genre of Buddhist writing and teaching. So you get different levels and different individuals, but you also get a certain kind of commonality because everyone is, you have to stay within the bounds of the tradition of the genres. For example, if you're going to write a murder mystery, there has to be a murder in it. If you don't have a murder in it, it's not going to be a very good murder. Where's the murder? And the murder has to get solved. If you don't have that, the reader is going to be very disappointed. And similarly with other kinds of genres, in a romantic literature genre, if they decide about 10 pages into it, they don't care about romance at all, they just want to go work with animals in far parts of the world, romantic readers are going to be very disappointed. And similarly, the readers actually help create a genre. That's an important thing to understand. I mean, certainly you have these anonymous writers who've been lost, whose names are lost to history, but they have to write things that their readers are going to take as and the ones that are going to get preserved fill that kind of function of being true to their type. So we have this development of this what's now called the canon. We call it the polycanon because that's the only one that survives. There are actually as many as a dozen different canons. There's a tremendous amount of literature that was written, but only certain portions of it survive. And what we have is the tradition that comes from Sri Lanka called the Theravada, and it's written in the language of Pali. And it consists, the polycanon has three parts to it. It has these sutras, which are generally, at such and such a place, the Buddha said this. But a lot of times, they're just little discourses on the religious life or the spiritual life too. They don't actually, they drop the four part. If you're going to, I have written sutras myself because I'm a literary forger by nature. and it's always intriguing to see if you can recreate one of these kinds of things, like a gospel or a sutra or whatever. So yeah, you have certain things you have to put in the beginning. I was at this park, Deer Park, and the Buddha said this, and so forth and so on. This is a standard way you begin it. But sometimes they drop that and they just start to expound on it, and you'll see that as we read some of these. So the sutras, though, the idea is that Buddha is the principal speaker, although in this sense Buddha is representing kind of an enlightened person. So an enlightened person is going to tell you about reality. That's the general idea of the sutra. And those are the sort of original texts. Later in the tradition, they develop commentaries. And in Buddhism, the commentaries are much more numerous than the original texts, particularly in something like Tibetan Buddhism. The earliest commentaries were called Abhidharma, which means after the Dharma or later Dharma. And it's the idea that they're kind of consolidating. What are the ideas here? What are the main ideas? And we're going to do sutras first. We'll do Abhidharma. And then there's a third basket of writings that are called Vinaya, which were the rules of discipline. Because the early Buddha created an order of monks. And this order that he created had rules. But if you look at rules, they really are what we would nowadays call instructions on the path. Every rule is really a kind of a life instruction, if you will. Now, if you're trying to lead a very disciplined, highly disciplined life, like in the monastic setting, you have a lot of these kinds of instructions. And they would develop organically as situations would come up. Like somebody would do something and everyone would go, well, that doesn't seem like a noble monk should be doing that. So then there would be a new rule. So they probably started out with 4 or 5 rules, and they ended up with a couple hundred. And that says something about the religious function. But generally, the way to understand them is to see them as instructions. So when you read that kind of thing, and even today when we give instructions on meditation or instructions on this practice or that practice, that's the kind of, in one way, that's the most valuable part. Because the rest of it, we're talking about a view, a philosophy. But here we're telling you how you can do it yourself, how you can actually understand and live this kind of life. So that's the third basket, the discipline, the book of discipline. So rather than one way to, there are many ways you can tell the story of the Buddha, but one of the interesting ways, and the one that I like, is taking off of this idea, the title of the Acts of the Buddha. So the Buddha is a sort of archetypal, enlightened being. What in Indian tradition they would call an avatar, someone who comes into the world to speak truth. Christ in the Hindus, which of course I like to include everything. Christ is an avatar, Buddha is an avatar, and they come and they have a certain progression. Archetypally or mythologically, there's certain kinds of things that every hero of this type does, certain stages in their development. So this is the approach that Ashabodha takes. It's also very much the approach that one of my teachers, Joseph Campbell, took. His famous book was Hero with 1,000 Faces. So in Joseph Campbell's book, and I studied personally with him, the idea was that every hero had a certain kinds of stages. There was this kind of archetypal unfolding. And you could, there were local elements and there were specific cultural elements and so forth, but everyone had kind of a similar path. And the interesting point here in terms of our own spiritual path is that we too follow this archetypal pattern. We're all Buddhas. We'll eventually become Buddhas. We'll eventually do this. But even in our own life, we take these kind of steps. And in our own spiritual development, we follow a certain kind of archetypal path, if you will. So the first act of a Buddha, and here we'll go back to Shakyamuni Buddha as the grand archetype. Shakyamuni Buddha starts off in Tushita heaven. Now Tushita heaven is the heaven for people who have, in their past lives, and remember in India you always have endless amounts of lives, and the Shakyamuni Buddha just doesn't appear out of nowhere. He has in fact been living thousands of lives perfecting himself. And having perfected himself in his previous life, he now dwells in the Tushita heaven. And this is where future Buddhas wait to be born. The next Buddha, and Buddha, there are lots of Buddhas. There's a Buddha, Shakyamuni is one of a countless number who came before him, and a countless number who may come after him, although the stories vary at that point. Currently, Maitreya Buddha rests in the Tushita heaven waiting for his rebirth. But that is the thing that you do. Now, to understand for a little bit what that means, I will show you a little map here. This is taken from an interesting book called Rebirth, The Game of Tibetan Liberation, which perhaps tonight we'll play as a test for those to see where we're all at. But in this particular game, I'll show you the game board. Here we are in the human realm, way down here. And the human realm has many choices. That's the idea of human realm. And as you play it as a game, you have a die. See, it'd be my Garuda holding the real life here. So you have many choices, and this all down here is what's called the lower realms. So these are places where the suffering is even worse than here. Ghost realms, hell realms, animal realms, all sorts of more constrained states than we have. And then right above us are like better planets than this, so to speak, where there's more happiness and you have more powers and there's more freedom and so forth. But this all is all reincarnating back and forth. So you're never free. you might go up here for a while, you go down here, and interestingly, when you play the game with this one-sided dice, the only way you can advance is by throwing ones. So anything less than that will, and you can imagine, you eventually, when I've played this before,
It's a terrible game.
Right?
It's not fun.
Cycle downward constantly.
you constantly cycle downward, but then eventually you throw a number of ones in a row, and you enter into this area, which is like higher states of religious training, like bodhisattva states. There are 10 bodhisattva levels and so forth. So this is, and various kinds of special kind of like training places where you go and stuff. So this is, and there's some point in here, and I'm not sure which square it is, it's called the point of no return, where no longer do you just cycle around a lot of pleasant places of training, but you don't actually go back and do the hell realms again. And then you get up, finally you get up to about here. So you can see how far it is and how long it would take you, because you got to throw a lot of ones to get up here. And that's Tashita Heaven. And then from Tashita Heaven, you're going to start your life as a Buddha. So, in our own situation, Tashita Heaven represents everything that came before. So, you have if you've had children, you realize that children come into this world with a lot already. Where they got it, we don't know, but from somewhere, they brought a lot of predispositions and genetic capabilities and so forth, however you want to look at that. But certainly, every one of us has brought something in here into a particular life. And at the same time, we also, in a way, come out of the timeless. We come out of the mystery, whatever, the wonder. And that's Tashita Heaven. That's the mystery, something that's the pre-life. So that's the first step of a Buddha, that he starts off in the Tashita Heaven. And to be in Tashita Heaven, you actually have had prior experience. So the second act of a Buddha is the act of taking birth. So in Shakyamuni's case, he's in Tashita Heaven, and the moment arrives. It's time for a Buddha to be born in this world. And the birth of a Buddha is a major event. And it doesn't happen very often. It only happens, every 5,000 years maybe, some long period of time. And so it's a very big event. And the whole cosmos is kind of in expectation of this kind of event. And the moment arrives, and the Buddha takes birth. And it's always a very auspicious kind of thing. Avatars, Buddhas, heroes, they're always born to distinguished, noble parents under great circumstances with no pain to the mother, and they're beautiful babies and so forth and so on. And this is true of the Buddha. Of course, it's true of Christ too. There's a lot. They had to go back and fill in his birth story, because if you're going to be a hero of the world, the savior of the world, you have to have a decent, birth story, lineage. Mm-hmm. And it's very fun. Birth stories are like the first things that ever get written. And in our own case, at some point, obviously, since we're here, our moment arrived, and as Heidegger would say, we were thrown into time and place. We were thrown out of the timeless, where we might have been very happy, and maybe our timeless moment was just in the womb, but that was pre-existence too. So we're thrown into time and place. We take birth. We have to actually encounter this particular world as a particular person at a particular time, and all of that circumstantial karma and conditioning that involves. So that's taking birth. Now, of course, the Buddha was born to a king and a queen. The mother had a dream of a white elephant entering her body. When she's, after 10 lunar months, she's in a garden She holds on to a tree, and the Buddha emerges painlessly out of her side, and immediately takes 10 steps in each direction, saying, "This is my last life." Supernatural. Babies of this type always have little special powers that ordinary babies do not have. Like being able to walk instantly or talk instantly,
Scary.
which would definitely set them apart. And you find that actually, the Umbrella Academy is the one that I'm watching right now.
Uh-huh.
And what happens is all of a sudden they do that same thing. No one's pregnant, the babies just pop. All of a sudden, right away, this magical event happens and these babies are born. So they're obviously going to be very special, and then somebody rounds them up for, and so forth and so on. So that takes us to act number 3, which is called Life in the Palace. So as we said, Shakyamuni Buddha is born to a king and a queen, and the early soothsayer, you always have a soothsayer. You have one in the Christ story, you have one in the Buddha story. I will point out the Buddha story is somewhat earlier, although when it's actually getting written down, it's all happening, they're all doing this at the same time. But soothsayer has to show up, and the soothsayer says, in the Buddha's case, well, this is a very special baby. Well, they know that. And he says, he's either going to be the ruler of the entire world, what's called Chakravartin in Sanskrit, or he's going to be the great liberator of mankind. And I can't tell which. And so that's the soothsayer's prediction. Now his father is a king, his father is a ruler, and his father does not like this idea of his son becoming a renunciate and going off and living in the woods and becoming a teacher of religious truth. He'd much rather have his son be the ruler of the world, obviously. And so what he's going to do, knowing this prophecy has been uttered, is that he's going to make sure the Buddha doesn't have any unpleasant experiences. He's going to protect him. Now, of course, nowadays we have protective mothers and all different kinds of ways in which children are protected, but this was like super protection. He's going to make sure that his son has no bad experiences whatsoever, and he's got the means to do that. So he has this incredible palace, as the story goes, and the Buddha is put in the penthouse. He's not even allowed to go to the lower floors of the palace. He lives just in the penthouse, and he receives everything he needs there. And there are several aspects to being having this kind of life of the palace phase. One is it gives time for the child to develop his abilities and to learn everything there is to learn about this world and this time and place that we're thrown into. And you learn that under protective circumstances. And the other aspect of the palace is that because you're protected, you're also kept away from these deeper realities of existence. And in Shakyamuni Buddha's case, that was precisely his father's idea, was that he was going to keep him away from unpleasant things. So what's pleasant is sensual pleasure. So the Buddha has like the best access to sensual pleasure of anyone who's ever lived. He's put in a palace, it's filled with dancing women, it's filled with all sorts of pleasant people, and that's the kind of life. And as he grows, he gets to be 16, he then has this period, and ironically, it's a very long period. He's 16, he's mature, he takes a wife, and he stays in the palace 13 more years. So he doesn't leave the palace until he's 29. So he has a full measure of sensual pleasure. He has like 13 years of it. And of course it's like India, so it's not, there's no restrictions. He's got the most beautiful women, filling the palace. There's songs, there's dance, there's constant party. It's a 13-year party that he gets to take part in. And that's the part where I'm not going to read it because it would take us too far off track. But beautiful part in here where Ashvaghosha goes Bollywood. Just being India, right? It's totally Bollywood. I mean, everybody's glamorous, everybody's singing and dancing, and the colors are beautiful. Every sensual pleasure is catered to. Everybody is like perfect peak physical condition. There's no pain, there's no suffering. Everything is just totally beautiful and pleasant. And he goes quite at length to that. But eventually, it is not the Buddha's destiny to spend his life partying. So the gods start to arrange for him to have a certain encounters with reality. And he discovers that there are these beautiful gardens that are outside of the palace, some few miles away, and he decides he wants to visit those. So this causes his father some concern because he hasn't really been letting leave the penthouse, but now he wants to leave the penthouse and go for a trip. He's, of course, 28 years old, so it took him 13 years to decide that would be a good idea. But at any rate, he decides that's what he's going to do. And his father cleans up the whole town, makes sure that nobody non-glamorous is on the street, sort of like how they made Boulder, Colorado. There was a time when they built the mall that I believe that they had done the same thing, because you never saw anybody who was unfit or over 40 wandering the streets. But it was like that, so it was very beautiful. It's like a shopping mall kind of thing. So you kind of let them go through this kind of Disney version of reality, where everything's been cleaned up and prepared. And the Buddha sets forth, and of course, all the women are just falling out of the windows, gushing as this beautiful, handsome man drives in his chariot, and it's down the road, and he's going to go to these pleasure gardens. Well, he goes for a little ways, and then all of a sudden, he looks over, and there's this old man who's really old, and he's hobbling about, and he's just, he looks terrible. And the Buddha goes, "What is that?" And he's got this charioteer, and the charioteer is sort of actually possessed by a god at this point. He's also, the god is, of course, acting as an old man. One of the gods is charioteers. He's going to have to, the gods are ushering him into reality, if you will. And the charioteer says, "Well, that's an old man." And the Buddha says, "Well, what is an old man?" He says, "Well, that happens to everyone. We all get old, and we all look like that eventually." And this is the first time, per the story, that the Buddha realizes that, whoa, the party has an end, that this is not permanent. So he says, and this whole idea that you're going to grow old depresses him quite a bit. And you have to imagine that. You never had this idea that you just think that this is just, everything is just going to be perfect forever and ever. And then all of a sudden you see that it's not. And that's extremely distressing. So he says, "All right, enough, this outing is over. I'm back to the palace." So he goes back to the palace. And he thinks about this and this growing old and so forth. And then the next time, he gets over that. And he says, "All right, let's go to the gardens again." So the next time he goes out to go to the gardens, there's this person who's really sick on the side of the road. And this person even looks worse than the old man. This person can hardly move, he's crawling, he's, oozing, whatever. You can just sort of imagine how you would film this, if you will. And this is even worse. There's one thing to get old, but to be sick and old, that's even worse. That's I can tell you, being old. Being old is not so bad, but being sick and old, that's not so good at all. And so that's totally distressing to the Buddha. It's not just a matter that we're going to get old, and change our form, but that we're going to actually suffer and have a lot of pain, and there's not going to be a lot that people are going to do about that. And it's going to be a totally unpleasant experience. And so that distresses him. He says, all right, this outing's over, back to the palace. So he goes back to the palace and then thinks about that for a while. And after a while, he's okay with that. He says, all right, let's try the gardens one more time. And this time, the third time he goes out to go to the gardens, they're driving around and it's all very nice and everything. And he's like, and they look over there and somebody's being carried on a stretcher. And it's a corpse. He sees this corpse on a stretcher. And he says to his charioteer, well, what's that? And he said, well, that's a dead man. He goes, what is that? And he says, well, after we become old and sick, we die. And everyone dies. And that's just the way things are. And you're going to die, and I'm going to die, and your father, everyone's going to die, and we're all going to be like that, not too far down the road. And this is the most distressing thing of all. I mean, it's one thing to get old, it's another thing to get sick, but to die, my gosh, that's terminal. So that ends the pleasure trip that day. And it's very interesting. Up until then, the Buddha is sort of trying to, incorporate these things, the old age, the sickness. And he doesn't change his life because of old age and sickness. But when he sees death, he said, all of a sudden he decides, I've got to do something. He realizes that his current way of living in the palace has come to an end. That death marks something that you actually have to respond to in some way. And he's not quite sure how to respond to it. He gets the idea that it's all going to happen. And then, as he's looking out over the gardens of the palace, then he sees courtesy again of the gods planting somebody there. He sees an ascetic. He sees somebody who has renounced the world and has gone off to seek a truth beyond birth and death. And the Buddha goes, that's what I need to do. I need to find the truth that's beyond birth and death. And so he develops the inner resolution to become a renunciate. And that takes us to the fourth act of the Buddha, which is called setting forth. And that is where he's going to go out on his own. And again, you can see the parallels with our more mundane human life. We also take birth in this realm. We're thrown into particular circumstances. Our parents do their best to protect us. Their best is never good enough. Sooner or later, we realize that there are some really deep problems going on cosmically on all levels. Things are somewhat messed up, and not it's not a paradise actually. And no matter how happy a childhood we have, at some point we come into contact with this larger realities that are not so pleasant, and we too set forth on our own. Generally, in our culture, we all do it around the same time, sometime when we're late teenagers, and it's a big deal. It's a big deal for the Buddha, it's a big deal for us, because if you look back on your life and you think, well, if I go back different times and change things, the only time where you really have a lot of choices where you can make major changes is right at that point when you set forth. Because pretty soon, after setting forth, you're going to find some kind of work that you end up doing. You're going to find some people that you're going to end up spending time with. You're going to get into family situations. You're going to get all kinds of situations, which from then on, you don't have as many choices as you had when you were, say, 18 and leaving home. That there's a very short period in your life where you really have, things are wide open. You could be anything. At least you really can't be, because you're sort of pushed by your karma and so forth and your understanding, but you feel that way. You feel this kind of real sense of freedom. And that's the Buddha's. He decides he's going to set forth, so he does leave the palace with the help of his charioteer, who again is being possessed by a deity. It's very funny, because the charioteer he gets possessed by the deity, so he has to tell the Buddha the facts about things, and he has to help him leave the palace. And later on, after he leaves the Buddha at the forest, he goes back to the palace and they say, "How could you do this?" You know, the king's all over. He says, "It wasn't me."
The devil.
I don't know why.
did
Yeah,
it.
yeah. The Buddha's, the devas made me do it, and he has no idea why he did this. But it's meant to happen, so it happens. And he leaves the palace, and he surrenders his garments, and he takes on the robe of ascetic, and even though the palace is well protected, all the gates magically open, the horse makes no sound as it goes by, the gods are like cushioning its footsteps and so forth. And this is another aspect that doesn't get mentioned too often, but is rather important, and something that Joseph Campbell would pick up on, is that there is divine assistance going on here, particularly at that point when we set forth into the world, that we start to, we're sort of in this protective state, but once we're on our own, cold out in the world, we're not actually totally on our own. We have the help, invisible helpers. In this case, in the Buddha's case, they're called devas. They're like local deities, local gods. And they're trying to help him, and they're sort of making all this happen. And that's true too, is we have more resources than we imagine that we have. I think young people often feel that they're completely on their own and have nothing. And then when they lose confidence in their parents, which happens sometime in their teenage years, and then they really feel like utterly, and it's overwhelming. And it doesn't have to be quite that overwhelming, because there are actually forces that are trying to help us up to a point. But the setting forth is very big, and that's where you decide, I'm going to go out and make my own life. And in the Buddha's case, it's a spiritual life that he's making. So the idea of the setting forth to have the spiritual life is quite important. So that's step 4. And then step 5 is spiritual training. So what the Buddha does is he's renounced the life in the palace, but that's not enough. Just to say, well, I'm done with these parties. That doesn't prepare you really to be a wise sage. That kind of, you have to train spiritually. So he goes through all the different training pure things of that time. And we could call this the wellness industry of the day. That there's a great industry out there in India, and there is today here in America. I mean, lots of people have gone out in the world, and they've come up with little things that are helpful for people who have anxieties about being on their own, and there's a whole wellness industry. And in India, the wellness industry, which consists of a vast number of techniques and things, of course you have to pay for all of this. But you go out and you find whatever it is, and everyone has something for you there. But the Buddha is pretty discerning, and he's trying to seek out like the best teachers of his day. And he finds 2 teachers that are quite good, and they understand that sensual pleasure is something in the body and all of that. So they teach a way in which you can separate the soul from the body. That is their teaching. Whereas a lot of the lower level of the wellness industry is just trying to get your body, kind of comfortable. But this level, they're talking about the body's not where it's at. We want to get the soul developed and separate the soul out. In India, that's called the self with the capital S. You want to discover yourself with a big S, not your mundane self, but your divine self. And these 2 teachers are going to have developed these states of meditations and trance meditations. In fact, the whole jhana meditations, which we'll talk about down the road, are all taught to him by these 2 Hindu teachers. He didn't invent that himself. Those were taught to him. That's what they taught. They said, well, we can teach you these trance states where you basically drop your body. You leave your body. And even in Zen today, they talk about the necessity to drop your body. That is simply not to be bothered by the physical, so that you can have a sort of a pure spiritual experience. But the Buddha is not satisfied with these two teachers. He's not interested in creating a spiritual pleasure palace in place of the physical spiritual palace. He's not interested in these beatific, blissful, meditative states that are being taught. Because he's very acute, and he sees that none of those escape the cause and effect. When I showed you the map earlier, there are nicer states than the human realm, but they're just recycling back into the human realm and the lower realms, and you're not escaping anything. You're just getting a respite. So yeah, you can go off for you can take a week and you go down to Cancun, but you have to come back. And that's the part that he didn't like. He realized that, yeah, they had a Cancun spiritual experience, all inclusive, But a week, 2 weeks, a month, he was going to have to come back to a world that was not a resort. And so he wants, and this is really a critical point here, he wants a teaching or a realization beyond cause and effect. He wants to go beyond the causal pattern. He wants to break this whole cycle. He wants liberation. He wants to be free of this continual churning. Now, with studying with these teachers and doing the various ascetic practices, he spends about 7 years training and trying all these different things. And he kind of ends up on his own trying to lead the ascetic life. And the ascetic life at that time and to this day is very well developed in India, probably more so in the past. I imagine it's diminishing, but basically you torture yourself and to get and so the Buddha starts to starve himself. And fasting is kind of a step in that direction, but he goes in extreme fasting. So he's down to eating 1 grain of rice a day, and he's just wasting away. And he's trying to it's this denial of the physical, this denial of the body, this total kind of hard renunciate life. He has to go through all of that too. But eventually, again with the help of the Buddhas, he comes to the realization this is not getting him anywhere. That starving himself and denying things and trying to be like an extreme yogi is not. He gets a lot of attention from the other yogis. He's the king of the yogis by this point. He's got followers, 5 followers who think, wow, this guy really does it. I mean, this guy he's the ultimate, ascetic. And he's the extremist we want. But he realizes himself that this is not getting him anywhere. So he gets to the 6th act of a Buddha, the 6th stage, which is you leave the training behind. The training is useful. In a sense, it's useful because you have to exhaust all these possibilities that you think might be worthwhile, and you exhaust them and you realize that they're not worthwhile, so you write your novels, you raise your children, you do your career, everything that you have a predisposition for that you think is going to improve things, you have to work your way through and exhaust all of that. And at some point you realize that wasn't it. That wasn't really taking me to this ultimate realization. So in the 6th act of a Buddha, you leave the training behind. And in Buddhist terms, he said that's where the path of accumulation ends. So before then, there's this great long period called the path of accumulation. in which you get all sorts of teachings and techniques and practices and abhishekas, and you go to all the different teachers and you check out the whole thing and all of the different possibilities, and you try all these different things and so forth. But at some point, you stop accumulating, and then downsizing begins. Emptiness begins, and that's when what's her name, Marie Kodama, shows up.
Condo.
You call in Marie. I've got too much. I've got to get rid of this stuff. And the little helpful, she's like a little goddess, right? She comes in and says, "Oh no, we can get this. We can take care of this. We'll get your mind cleared out. We'll get your life house cleared out." So you start to empty stuff, and that's the sixth stage, the leaving the training behind. And again, it's something that everyone goes through, where you realize that you don't have anything more to prove. You don't have any agenda. You've exhausted sort of all your ambitions. Now, some people never reach these stages, of course. They keep trying to work it forever until they finally die. But if you're fortunate, you realize at some point that there is, in fact, nothing to prove. No agenda. Audience, the whole audience that you're trying to impress, that you've been trying to impress since childhood, are just empty beings like yourself. They're just like you're just looking in a mirror, really. And at that point, you just abandon the whole idea of a path altogether, spiritual path. And of course, this is sort of where Dzogchen picks up. starts there with this idea that, well, let's start with abandoning the path and save you all this trouble. Unfortunately, if you have these impulses and you have this agenda and you have these desires, then you do have to, have some kind of realization where they dissipate. Otherwise, you're going to continually want to go in that direction. Interestingly enough, if we switch legends here, we go over to, let's say, Christian legend, and the Gospels begin with the Gospel of Mark, which is in some ways the best. Gospel of Mark starts off, there was this man in the wild, John the Baptist, who was baptizing people, and one day Jesus shows up. Well, he's starting right at that level, that Dzogchen level I talked about. Where Jesus is actually leaving his training behind. He's 30 years old. He's obviously gone through something, but they never tell us what. Now later on, Luke and other gospel writers will pull it out, and there are infancy gospels which aren't included in the canonical ones that flesh it out even more and so forth. But the brilliance of that particular gospel, the Gospel of Mark, is he starts right there. This guy shows up, and he's actually beyond training at that point. And in fact, when he goes to get baptized, the dove comes down from the sky, and God says, "Yep, you're ready. You're time to take you out of the oven." Now you would think that would be the end of the story, I mean, we would love that to be the end of the story, wouldn't we? That we finally decide, hey, I have nothing to prove, I have no agenda, I'm done with all this, I've exhausted all my, and here I am, and the dove comes down and gets on my shoulder, and we go, oh, this is wonderful, and life happily after. But it doesn't actually work that way. You have to then, now you're ready, now that you've got rid of all this lesser kind of karmic obligation and so forth, now you're ready for real training. And real training, in the case of the Buddha, and similarly in the case of Christ, is done by the devil himself. That's when you get Mara, or Satan. You get the embodiment of all karma tests you. So Mara, who predates Satan by some time, he is the embodiment of hope and fear. And that is what keeps the whole karmic wheel turning all the time. And so we hope for something better, we're trying to avoid something, and that's our motivating, that's the general motivating factor. So now we're tempted. And Mara does not like to see, Mara or Satan or whoever, but we're talking about, we're going to confront the deepest driving force to karma itself. And that is the test. So the Buddha's going to get tempted. But before he gets tempted, actually, he's left, just to stop back, he's left the training behind. He goes and he takes some milk rice from a goddess who's appearing as a milkmaid. Again, that divine element comes in. And he's nourished for the first time in a number of years. And he sits under the Bodhi tree. And he makes this resolution that he's not going to leave the Bodhi tree until he has everything is completely clear. So what leaving your training behind prepares you to do is actually have this kind of ultimate realization about how things are. And that's the experience the Buddha's going to have in his night of Buddhahood as he sits under the Bodhi tree. And of course in Ashvaghossa's account, as he sits under the Bodhi tree, there's tremors around the world, all the deities of that period are all gathered around because something's going to happen. This is the story, the movie's getting right to the good part here. All the babies that are in their cribs from all around the world all turn towards the Bodhi tree. Winds are blowing. I mean, this is the cosmic event. But the first part of the cosmic event is you have to conquer, you have to be tested. Are you really ready? I mean, it's not enough to say you're leaving everything behind and drop everything, but have you really dropped everything? That's the test. And that was the test that Christ had. He gets these various tests, and the Buddha does too. And the first, the Buddha sends Mara, who represents ignorance and hope and fear and all of that. He has these various armies that he sends. And in Buddha's terms, he has actually a bunch of armies. Desire, dislike, craving, hunger and thirst, self-doubt, fear, laziness, and obstinacy. That's one of my favorite ones. Obstinacy is called obstinacy restlessness. That you're both stubborn and you're restless. Yeah, and which is essentially a lack of patience, right? You're just sort of anxious, and that's another one of his kind of armies. And then of course the passions as well. So the Mara, or the tempter, or whoever gets to play that mythological role, he's got a lot of resources. He can throw all sorts of things at you to see if you really are beyond training. Have you really cut through desire? Are you really at this point where you're really ready to see things clearly? Or are you just pretending? So the Buddha's got to be tested. So the first temptation is he sends the infamous daughters of Mara. And those are the beautiful women who come and say, this ascetic life is ridiculous. Come with us. We can give you a much better time, and so forth. But the Buddha, having spent 13 years in the palace, he's already burned that karma up. He's already seen that. He knows that. He's not going back there. So that doesn't work at all with him, although generally it's effective on almost everybody else in the world. Any kind of total. This is the time where you can have total passion, total. You can have the perfect lover, the perfect, and who's not going to go for that? But the Buddha doesn't, because he's going to be a Buddha, right? And so then Mara says, all right, I'm going to send my army. So he sends all the demon armies, and they all attack the Buddha. And as it is, the demons, as they get close to the Buddha, their arrows, their stones, their projectiles, they all change to flowers. And all of a sudden this rain of flowers just comes down on the Buddha. Because he has no fear. He's nothing can disturb him. He's there he's made his vow, he's going to see it all, and he's not going to be distracted in any way at all. So all sorts of possible distractions, they don't work at all with him. So then Mara shows up personally and says, all right, you're pretty well developed here. You're not desire, fear, hope, fear, that's not affecting you. Very good. But tell me, who sent you? Whose authority are you going to be the Buddha? What divine power? What's backing you up here? You know, and the Buddha does something very interesting. He doesn't call on, his cosmic protectors or anything divine. He simply touches the earth. Very simple gesture. He touches the earth because the earth is his witness. That he's actually has a totally natural path. That his path is not supernatural. It's not divine authority. It's nothing of that, even though he's had helpers. But he himself, he's saying, well, my authority comes from the natural way things are, from the earth. I am that. And that is the most powerful statement one could make, because that is his own. He is a true, he's truly awakened on his own. And the earth is the witness to that he's achieved the natural state, as we would say in Dzogchen. So Mara leaves at that point, just like in the Christian, Satan leaves, and after a period of 40 days, and that whole process, it's very similar. And that prepares the Buddha for his night of enlightenment, where he sees everything. And we'll talk about that in a different talk, because that's there's a lot of pieces to that, to the night of enlightenment. But that is the general stage of the life of a Buddha. You go through all these different stages, and then you finally reach the point where you're under the tree and you're going to see it all as it is. And then there are you could say there are a couple other acts. Once you become a Buddha, you go off in the world and you teach, although nowadays we kind of do it all at the same time. But in the classic way, you become a Buddha and then you teach. And then there's the point where, being human, you depart. So there's the death of the Buddha, or the death of Christ. So in the Christ one, which is attenuated, he goes he has the doves on his shoulder. He goes to temptations. He survives that. Now he's truly the Christ. He's truly enlightened, awakened, Savior of the age. And he teaches for 3 years and puts that in motion. And then he has his death. And the Buddha has his death too. Of course, in the case of Christ, the death is the big event, because that's going to later understood to have saved the whole world. But in the Buddha's case, his death is simply his going into final nirvana, final realization, in which he becomes sort of one with enlightened, awakened energy. So whenever there's awakened energy, there is the Buddha. Buddha becomes part of the awakened energy and is no longer a person or an individual per se. But that liberation, and what we'll talk about, the final liberation that the Buddha is preparing himself for, is where he's going to step beyond karma. He's going to step beyond cause and effect. And that's really important, because we come from a tradition called the Dzogchen tradition, which is a tradition beyond cause and effect. That we're not telling you how to do this to get this, one thing leading to another. We're talking about what's before, around, after. What's the ultimate reality that's non-causal, that's beyond cause and effect. And that's what the Buddha was looking for. He could find teachers who would teach him great techniques to get great trances, but he wanted liberation. He wanted complete liberation from cause and effect. And there's a great quote here about karma that the Buddha, because the Buddha's going to teach cause and effect, because that's what we're trapped in. And this great quote on karma is, beings are owners of their actions. They are heirs of their actions. They originate from their actions. They are bound to their actions. And they have their actions as their refuge. So he's going to show in his teachings, we're jumping ahead a little bit, that everyone is trapped by karma, trapped by conditions, trapped by circumstances. But you can take that principle of karma, of cause and effect, and turn it around.